Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to session 3 of our Data Value Architect series, where we are unpacking the role of and impact of the Data Value Architect. And today, specifically, we'll be covering what the DVA actually does. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been teasing, the concept of data value assurance, the role of the DVA, and sort of what this translates back into an organization. The idea for today is really to show you what the week or what a week in the life of a DVA actually looks like. And context is always better than just plain theory. So as per usual, Mags is going to do her weekly reality check as well, because we know, as with everything in the world, we need to ground ourselves in reality as well. We get caught up in way too much hype, and we sort of lose track of what's actually happening. And today I'm glad, because I'll only be doing like 10% of the talking. Mags is really going to be sharing her expertise and insights around the data value architect role. So the hook for today is data value architect isn't just a title, it's a set of repeatable behaviors. Now, Mags, tell us a bit more around what is the DVA and why is the DVA so important, and why is it different from other roles that might already exist within an organization?
Thank you, John. Um, Being a DVA is quite difficult sometimes to explain to someone what you do.
Mm,
I've many times tried, for example, to explain to my mom that what I am doing, because being a DVA is not that your typical PM does, or your business analyst, or
mm,
even chief data analytical officer. Some of them would fulfill parts of the role that a TVA would fulfill, but as a whole entity, they
mm,
don't fulfill that role because they're so focused on the delivery of the entities and not focused on the value proposition. And that's where um, being a DVA for me has always been the key to unlocking the
mm,
value, and that thing. But the how is very much for me going into an organization and listen to the organization, becoming the glue,
mm,
representing the business when you speak to IT, representing IT when you speak to business, and explaining to IT how the data works so that it can fit into the models
mm,
right, and so that business can get the answers that they need to, that it's not a pipe work exercise in the IT environment. And that the data is
mm,
actually good quality. I think that's for me, gluing all of this together and having the community is what a
mm,
DVA should organize and make sure um, is there. So it's an enablement function. It's not a executing and delivery function, and it's to embed that solutions that eventually gets delivered into business, to get them to be used, to make sure that they are actually making the people's lives better and
mm,
addressing the issues. And then that role is critical for the success of any project.
mm.
If you don't have that there, then you often sit with a situation where product will be delivered and sitting on the shelf, or
Yeah.
data is not trusted, or stuff like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I almost see like the best way to explain it for most people that's interested in rugby is Rassie Erasmus is probably the closest thing to DVA that
Yeah,
you'll get,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
you've got the coaches that's focusing on the respective areas, you've got the players that's everybody's just focusing on getting what they are done, but there's somebody that orchestrates that value and that
yeah.
makes sure that you're putting certain things in and changing things around to always optimize that value. So I mean, it's,
Mm.
if you don't watch rugby, it's difficult to explain to you the power that be within Rassie. But for those of you that do, can sort of contextualize a bit more in terms of why this role is so important. It's not just another coach. It's not just another PM. It's not just another person, because you can still deliver stuff, on time, on budget, in scope, and still fail
Mm.
to deliver value, right? You can still do the right things. You always hear this, like, we've done all the right things, we've made all the right investments, but we still fail. Thanks for that, Mags. I think so. This week we're getting into sort of like, what does that week look like, and I want to start off setting the scene with what does that operating rhythm look like for DVA throughout the week to a great extent. Now, to what Mags mentioned is the DVA is really focused on orchestrating value, bringing teams together, and getting to that point. Now, in your typical sort of sprints, you would have what's the sprint plan for the week, what's the backlog, what do we need to do, and we sort of get those things done. But you can still deliver stuff without creating value at the end of the day. So the weekly operating rhythm, typically for a data value architect, and we'll get into a lot more detail around the data value assurance framework and the steps around data value assurance and stuff in the weeks to come. And I think this week we're just setting that operating rhythm and giving an idea of what the week looks like. So don't like be excited for what's coming, but don't look for too much detail on this week around how these things actually work. This will play out over the next couple of weeks in the next sessions as we go deeper into the actual assurance framework that the data value architect actually looks. But their week typically plays out like this. So their Mondays look a bit different than most other people's Mondays, right? So for them, it's not really blue Mondays unless it's blue chip Mondays where they're focusing on the high bets. But they typically start with the value check-in on a Monday. And this is where they do three things. They define the hypothesis, they define the metrics against that hypothesis, and they define who's going to own the value at the end of the day against which that metrics will be measured. Now, as we're going deeper into this, you'll hear the words around KPIs and those type of things being defined a lot. KPIs are not to be confused with value generating initiatives or VGI. So one VGI that says the company needs to produce X will have multiple KPIs that needs to be met in order for that VGI to realize. So this is now practically the week in the DVA is that first step is we need to understand what is our value hypothesis for the week. So we think if we do this, or we are fairly sure that if we do this, we can expect these results. What do we need to measure to make sure that we achieve those results, and who's going to own it? So in that first session on a Monday, they determine what are we planning from a value perspective for this week? How are we going to get there? Who needs to do what in terms of orchestrating this stuff? As to Max's previous point, it's not just a data problem. We have data, IT, and business in the same room working on these initiatives. And then lastly, who owns the output in terms of value, not artifacts? So who's going to be accountable at the end of the week to sign off to say we have delivered as expected on that value? And at that point, when you get to the Friday meeting, what is important is you might also then consider, what does it look like in terms of from value improvement? But we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So that's your Monday. On a Monday, you do a hypothesis, define your metrics, define the owners, and your plan is what are we planning? How are we getting there? Who needs to do what, and who owns the output in terms of value, but not artifacts? Then in the middle of the week, either your Wednesdays, Thursdays, depending on how you see middle of the week, it's always debatable. Like people always fighting about the, bi-weekly. Does it mean once every 2 weeks or twice a week? Whatever midweek means for you, it's sort of the midpoint check mark before you get towards your Friday where you're delivering the evidence back. Now on a midweek, like on a Wednesday, ideally, you do delivery alignment. Now this is very important. So we're going to jump from sport to sport. So today for midweek, we're going to be talking a bit about run rates, right? So for instance, if you're watching cricket, you ideally know the concept of a run rate. You have the actual run rate in terms of what you're actually producing per over, and then you have the required run rate. What do you need to in order to win? Looks very similar to the data value architect in terms of they will determine what the run rate is on a Monday. Midweek, they will do a check-in to see, are we on that run rate, or is there something that we're off in terms of the KPIs? Are we meeting those? Are there things that we need to adjust? Where do we need to adjust? Where do we need to pivot? And where do we need to make some changes? So on a Wednesday, they do delivery alignment, and then they focus on scope. They look at risks, they look at assumptions that needs to be made, or assumptions that were made, and then they also look at the readiness of the data in order to support the value result at the end of the week. So on a Wednesday, then they do the pulse check. So they see if we're actually doing what we need to do. They determine the required run rate, and then they also determine if there's any possible value at risk. It might mean that, if something is not delivered this week, there's potential value that might be lost, or there's value that's going to be at risk. Either we're not going to realize it at all, or we might need to delay some things over time. So that's the first bit. The second part then towards it is just making sure that they have a complete continuous check-in in terms of where they are during that midweek, so that they don't wait for the Friday when it's too late, right? Because when you're in the game of value, you don't run months, you don't run quarters. You don't run, half one, half two in the year, or run it annually. This is stuff that you need to have your hands on continuously to ensure that you're tracking value and you're intervening where possible, right? Some cases, yes, it might take multiple weeks to get there, but typically this is what a DVA does, because they're running multiple projects at the same time or overseeing it from a value orchestration perspective. Then comes Friday, and Friday is the fun days where they get to present the value evidence back. So what moved, what didn't, and why. Now, if you're in the game of data analytics, you would have heard this terms many times where somebody says, but we really need to do stuff that moves the needle. Now, it means many things. And early on in my life, when I heard that for the first time, I thought it's people with like psychometric or something abilities where they can look at a needle on a piece of paper and they can just move it. But in essence, it actually comes down to that, is if you don't clearly articulate what it is that you're working towards, you sort of become this crystal ball thing where you're guessing stuff, at the end of the day. So we want to remove the guesswork. We want to get to a point where we're actually delivering the value, and we want to determine what needs to be done. Because we have clearly defined KPIs, we can measure to say the KPI improved or it didn't improve. What didn't improve? So certain KPIs, like for instance, this week, the amount of customers that we flagged for next best action reduced from 10,000 to 5,000. Why did this happen? Because this has got an impact on the value stream. Now, if you can determine why that happened, you can intervene. If you can see but this is something that's going to be a continuous problem, you then need to pivot. So on a Friday, when you're presenting that value evidence back as a DVA, very importantly, you determine the impact that was made during that week. And then the fun part comes is you also then report back on the value that was realized or that you publish now in your data income statement. And then the big question, is there any room for improvement, or can you improve that value? And what does that tangibly look like? That then becomes new items that then carries into the new week, which then there would be new hypotheses that gets formed around, if we do X, Y, and Z, we think we can improve the value by X margin at the end of the day. And this continuously then creates that concept of creating a hypothesis, measuring it midweek. Are you on time? Are you delivering what you're supposed to do in terms of, or on the mark in terms of the value? And then Friday, providing that evidence and then determining, have you now reached the upper mark, or is there any room for improvement? Now, Max, that's the sort of the 3 days. That's the most important for the DVA in terms of their operating rhythm. What does success look like from a DVA perspective? Keeping in mind sort of what they're doing within a week, from a Monday to a Friday.
The main thing for me when I look at success of a DVA is whether or not there were tangible value realized. Because it can sound like you're doing a lot of project management and ensuring everything is right and having all the stats about the project. But a lot of projects are delivered without tangible value, and it's for exactly having that delivered of that tangible value. Now, I use a scorecard that I typically look at that it is easiest. Maybe it's because I've been a predictive modeler. I'm very into the scorecard thing.
Numbers person.
Yeah. But it's for me, first of all, is it measured? Is that value actually measured? Because how many projects that start without actually knowing what are you going to do with your solution? What are you going to use that for? Why am I doing what I'm doing? So first of all, do I have that value? Do I have adoption happening? In other words, is when I deliver something, is someone using it for the reason that it's been delivered for? And are they using it effectively? Are they trusting it? Is the third one. So it is the governance, because a broken trust pulls absolute lines through the success of the analytics. So if we start with, is it measured? Definitely that we need to look at that it can be measured crystal clear. There is no confusion on what is actually measured. Everyone agrees on what is measured. It's trackable and it's physical evidence. It's a numeric something. And that value can be a physical rands and cents value. It can be a time It can be a penalty fee that you are saving. And there are many, many forms of values that can, but that it has to have a tangible value that is
Mm,
trackable is very important. It can't just be everyone is using the new dashboards.
mm,
So what? If you don't use it for the right stuff, or it doesn't impact decision on change behavior, then it doesn't matter.
yeah.
Um, so it's not about the artifact, it's about that value that it drives. So practically what this means is that there's leading indicators that can often give us an indication of whether or not something will go bad or go well in our process. So when you
Mm,
track these, you can see that what leading indicators is actually driving my value up and down, and you can enhance your processes
mm,
based on that leading indicators. And then you've got the lagging indicators, which is your financial or your operational impact that you can track on a weekly. That's your Friday thing.
yeah.
So that's your measurement. When I look at adoption, very important part for me, and that is probably the area that I love the most of being a DVA, is the actual adoption and ensuring that the people that needs to use it actually is
Mm,
able to use it effectively, that they are okay with where the buttons are, that they are feel comfortable, and that they are um, confident in using the solution that we give, and
mm.
in an attribute that we always look out for in a DVA is humbleness, or what's, I don't know the English word properly, but yeah, being
Proper humility.
humble.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, being humble. Um, is because DVA needs to be humble enough to explain the same thing 10 or 20 times
Mm,
and not get frustrated with that. Because it's about the embedding of that solution that came through. And then lastly is the risk management, and which is the where the data trust comes in, and governance and ethics. Now, when we're looking at that part of the DVA, the data trust, as I mentioned earlier, pulls. If there's no trust, then your analytics could be gone, and it would be okay.
mm,
It
yeah,
wouldn't be okay because the data trust is just
yeah.
gone, and and everyone will just say, oh, but I don't trust those reports, and I will go back to my old ways. So all
Mm,
this work that the ITE and the data people done with the business would be null and void, and it would
mm,
be just gone. So
yeah.
having applying these trust matrices and measuring your DVA or success on trust matrices, on whether or not governance is there and whether or not ethics is being followed, is very, very important, because it
Mm,
can go so easily wrong, especially on the trust side. And how many times just this week have I entered client sites where they just said to me, Mags, I've got a problem with the quality of my data.
mm,
And how am I going to do this and fix this? And if you can't fix that, the people are starting to realize eventually, after how many years. So I'm so happy about it. But that if you don't have your foundation ready, and that trust in that data layer, then you're not going to be able to deliver artifacts that is actually used and creates value.
yeah.
So it's the responsibility of the DVA, and I want to repeat this. It's the
Mm,
responsibility of the DVA to ensure that there's trust.
mm,
It is not the responsibility of the data engineer. It's
mm,
not the responsibility of the business. It is not the responsibility of the data person or analyst or data
yeah.
scientist. It's the DVA that needs to ensure that there's trust, because he or she needs to work with these people and get partner with them to the degree that everyone believes that the DVA is staying up at night with me about this
Mm,
data quality. And
yeah.
it's that makes it or breaks it eventually.
Yeah. It's that concept of extreme ownership to when you're a
Yes,
DVA, you owning value. And that means is you're taking ownership of all the things that leads to data value. It's the contracting in from the different areas. It's, the delivering of the actual results, making sure that you're measuring that value, making sure that there's adoption. Adoption is so important, right? So it's that concept of, how do you create data confident leaders at the end of the day, right? It's not about education, but it's creating people and instilling confidence so that when they have to make decisions, or they get information, they know exactly what to do with it. Even if the trust might be low, they can still make a decision with it. And you rightfully highlighted something, Max, that's so important, is that we have always done it this way. And it's the most
Yeah.
dangerous thing of like, well, let's just
Oh,
revert to the old way of doing things. Like, we already have reports that's sitting on old servers and old platforms and old things that's been keeping us like happy for a long time. Great. How much of that work that you've done historically is actually contributing towards value within the business?
um,
Because none of that work, I mean, and we have companies that, and they pride themselves in this, like, I've got 100,000 reports. Like, that is amazing. How many of those 100,000 reports actually contribute towards R1 of value or $1 worth of value into your organization? And more often than not, it doesn't at all, right? Because it came from a place of busy work. You also mentioned it. It's not about creating the artifact, it's about delivering the value at the end of the day. So the DVA role is so important and so critical. And I mean, it's a week in the DVA it's a stressful week, right? Because you're not just sort of defining the hypothesis and managing the value, but you're also playing orchestrator of bringing the parties together, making sure that priorities align, making sure that you're managing the risk, but also making sure that value actually gets realized. And I think one of the most important things that you said, Max, was around that data trust is actually, that's the thing that the DVA needs to drive and needs to own completely. Because data trust is not as simple as just having accurate data. It is, yes, my data might be good and trustworthy, but now do I trust my own ability to make decisions based on this data? And the DVA is the person that brings those two worlds together to a great extent. Max, thank you for that. I think giving us some insight into this. I think as we're going to get our shovels out and dig deeper into the DVA role over the next couple of weeks. I mean, as we're only on session 3, part 3. There's still 5 to come. And each one of those, we're going to take one step deeper into the role. What does it look like? What tools, methodologies do they use? And next week one is obviously one of the exciting ones. So before we get into that, the challenge for this week would be is assess your own role and where you are, like for instance, where you're situated currently within your organization, whether you're in finance or data or whatever it might be, and then try to determine how much adjustment will be required to pivot into the role of a DVA. So almost taking into consideration, so you don't necessarily become a fully blown DVA, but where you are you able to almost fulfill that role so you can start adding value and orchestrating value for your organization? And then also determine what components you can bring back to current initiatives that you are executing on. So the things that we spoke about today in terms of the things, what does success look like for a DVA? What does a week in the life of a DVA look like? Which of those things can you bring the learnings back, right? Maybe something like value hypothesis every time you run your sprints on a Monday. On Fridays afternoons, if it's bi-weekly, once every 2 weeks sprints. If you're presenting back, if you then question the value of what was created and why was value not created, even though the work was delayed. So there's a lot of things that you can take back. Chew on that, determine sort of what that looks like, and see if there's any value out of those things. As we're going along, I'm sure you will find additional content and additional collateral that will help you sort of frame what a DVA looks like within your own context. Now, that is sort of the highlight for this week. For next week, we're diving into, like, if you want to become a DVA, here is the path to pivot. So this is the fundamental moment, is how do you do a career pivot into the DVA? And because we're sort of unpacking this in a lot more detail, we will give you a view of what skills will be required to become a data value architect, what type of background, what type of personalities makes it good. DVA, like Mags, numbers people, people that like driving impact, people person, like you working with people and you've got a lot of patience with them. So you almost need to be like a very, like a unicorn of unicorns, if you will. But it's a very practical way of getting to that point. And later this year, we'll also be launching our data value architect training and certification program, which I think will also help, put down that
mm,
foundation for your career path. So next week, check it out, Career Pivot into DVA. Mags, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Maybe just a last thought for today is what would your key takeaway be, your, what do we call it, our weekly reality check? What is a weekly reality check for today's session that you just want us to consider and chew on as we go into the week and trying to deliver value from analytics?
Yeah, I think for me, this week it's important to ask the why question. When you
Mm,
have something and you're doing something, why are you doing it? And keep on asking that until you get to the value statement, because that why question drives you.
mm.
So yes, I would like to challenge you to do that.
What does the why look like? Reality check. Like,
Yeah,
why are we doing this? Max,
yeah.
thank you so much. Really appreciate your time as always. Thanks for everybody else that tuned in and listened this week. Remember to check out the other episodes that we have on YouTube and that we'll be sharing on the socials, and then keep an eye out for episode 4 or session 4 that's coming up next week. Have a good one. Cheers all.